Out where the wind never stops moving, and even silence has a weight, there lived a man who had lost everything. Not in a shootout or a fire, but in the quiet kind of tragedy that the West never wrote songs about. His wife had passed 2 winters before, and with her went the last piece of color in his world. The ranch still stood, the land still breathed, but the man had become a ghost with calloused hands. They said he was strong, too strong to break, but they didn't see the shovel he carried each morning, nor the grave he was digging, not for livestock, not for hire, but for himself. Neighbors whispered, of course, how he no longer rode into town, how his chimney never smoked, how the man who once sang to the herd at dusk hadn't spoken in months. There are many ways to die in the West, but grief is the slowest. It steals a man's soul while leaving his body behind. And so, one bitter evening, with the sun bleeding over the hills like it had nothing left to give, he finished the last scoop of dirt and sat on the edge of his grave, waiting for a reason not to use it. That reason came just before midnight, not with a gunshot or thunder, but with the softest sound the ranch had heard in years, a knock. Weak, uncertain, followed by a sniffle. He opened the door expecting dust or wind, but instead found a little girl no older than 10, eyes swollen from crying, her hands trembling as she held out a folded piece of paper. No words were spoken, just the note, slipped into his hand, and then she ran off into the night like a shadow swallowed by the moonlight. He stared at the paper for what felt like hours, too scared to hope and too tired to care. But when he finally opened it, the handwriting was crooked and clumsy, and it read, "Please don't go. I heard you singing once. My mama's gone too. I think you understand." That was it. Just 2 sentences. But they hit harder than any bullet. Because in that fragile cry for connection, the old rancher heard something he hadn't felt in years. A reason to stand back up. And what followed next would shake the very roots of that valley. Because when 2 souls marked by grief find each other in a land built on silence and dust, what blooms isn't just survival, it's redemption. Stay with this story, because it's not about death. It's about how one broken man and one forgotten child showed a whole town what it means to live again, when the West had already decided they wouldn't. The rancher's hands trembled as he held the note, not from fear, but from something more dangerous, feeling. It had been so long since anything pierced the numbness that surrounded his days. The words were simple, childlike, but they struck with the force of a runaway horse. Please don't go. He had once spoken those same words, kneeling beside his wife's bed, holding her hand as it went cold. Now, from the mouth of a child he didn't know, the words returned like a ghost, dragging him back to the surface. He didn't sleep that night. He sat by the fire, reading the note over and over as if it were scripture. Who was the girl? Where had she come from? How'd she know? But even louder than those questions was a whisper that he couldn't shake. You're not as alone as you think. By morning, the grave outside remained untouched. He filled it in, not because he felt saved, but because something in him said it was no longer his time to go. The next day, he saddled his horse, the first time in nearly a year, and rode into town. Folks watched from behind curtains and cracked doors. He was thinner now, his face drawn, but there was a different kind of weight behind his eyes. At the general store, he asked about a girl, maybe 10 years old, traveling alone. The storekeep shook his head, confused. No one had seen anyone like that. Not lately. But the old widow on the edge of town, she remembered hearing footsteps in the night. Thought it was just the wind. Now she wasn't so sure. He spent the next 3 days riding the outskirts of the valley, calling out through the trees, following footprints half erased by wind. At night, he'd leave biscuits and a blanket by his porch, just in case. On the 4th evening, he returned home to find the blanket gone, and another note tucked under a stone. You're still here. So I will be too. That night, he wept for the first time since he buried his wife. Not out of sorrow, but out of something even more unfamiliar. Hope. It wasn't long before he saw her again. Small, with tangled hair and a worn dress. She appeared at the edge of the pasture like a coyote, too used to running. He didn't approach, just nodded once, and sat down on the porch, leaving space beside him. Slowly, cautiously, she joined him. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Because sometimes, the loneliest souls find each other without a word, drawn together by the weight of things no one else can see. Her name was Ellie, and it came out days later, not with fanfare, but as a whisper while she watched him fix the fence. "My name's Ellie," she said, voice barely louder than the wind. He didn't look up, just nodded, and said, "Mine's Cole." That was it. No questions, no demands, just an unspoken agreement. We've both been through enough. And in that quiet understanding, something began to bloom between them, fragile, like spring grass pushing through frost. Cole didn't ask about her past. He didn't need to. The way she flinched at thunder, the way she clung to silence like armor, the way she never slept more than a few hours at a time, it told him everything. Somewhere out there, Ellie had been left behind, maybe by fate, maybe by blood. Either way, she had carried herself across the cruel lands of the West and landed on his doorstep with nothing but a note and a name. And somehow, it had been enough to change the course of his life. The days took on new rhythm. Mornings were for chores, feeding the livestock, mending what time had broken. Afternoons brought quiet moments in the shade of the barn, where Ellie would draw in the dirt with a stick while Cole sharpened tools. She began to speak more, not all at once, but in fragments. Little memories. A mother's lullaby. The smell of a blue dress. The moment she realized she was alone. Cole listened the way he used to listen to his wife, reading by lamplight, with his whole soul. The townsfolk noticed the change. Cole no longer looked like a man waiting to die. He had color in his face, rhythm in his steps. And when he came to town now, Ellie was often beside him, her hand in his, her eyes scanning every face with quiet calculation. Some questioned, others whispered, but no one dared challenge them. Not after what they both walked through. Not after the way they carried each other. Not as burden, but as purpose. And through it all, the land responded. The crops grew greener. The horses calmed easier. Even the wind seemed to lose some of its bite. It was as if the ranch itself had been holding its breath, waiting for this reunion of broken souls to bring it back to life. And as Ellie laughed, truly laughed, one warm evening while chasing a runaway chicken across the yard, Cole realized something he hadn't felt in years. This land needs me. And she does too. One day, while repairing the barn roof, Cole spotted something in Ellie's hands, a rusted harmonica. She held it like it was sacred, wiping it gently with her sleeve. He paused, memories flickering. His wife used to play one just like in the evenings, sitting by the fire, her music soft enough to make coyotes forget their howls. "You play?" he asked. Ellie shrugged. "Mama did. I'm trying to remember." And she pressed it to her lips. The sound came out crooked, hesitant, but real. Cole closed his eyes. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive. That night, the harmonica's tune drifted across the valley, not loud, not polished, just steady. The neighbors heard it too. Some sat on their porches in silence. Others wiped tears they didn't fully understand. In a land where death had always spoken louder than life, one girl's music had found the cracks and started to fill them. The ranch, once a tombstone to memory, had become something else entirely. A place where healing wasn't announced, but quietly invited in. But not everyone welcomed the change. There was a man named Judson Pike, a landowner known more for cruelty than cattle. He tried to buy Cole's land twice, once with money, once with threats. Both times, Cole refused. Now, hearing that the widowed rancher had taken in a child, Pike saw weakness, vulnerability, a reason to strike. The West had always had men like him. Polished boots, empty hearts. And as word spread that Ellie wasn't his kin, Pike saw opportunity. One evening, Pike rode up the trail, dust trailing behind him like a warning. He dismounted slow, hand resting too comfortably on his belt. "Heard you've got a stray," he said. "Could get you in trouble, Cole. Taking in what ain't yours." Ellie stood behind the screen door, watching. Cole didn't answer. He stepped forward, eyes cold, spine straight. "She left a note," he said. "Didn't ask for much. Just that I don't leave her alone in this world." Pike smirked. "Still sounds like trouble." Cole didn't blink. "Then you're speaking to the wrong man." Pike left that night, but not quietly. "You'll regret it," he called, mounting his horse. "This land remembers debts." Cole watched him disappear over the ridge, jaw clenched. He wasn't afraid, not for himself. But now, there was something more to protect. And in the West, Protecting something soft often meant becoming harder than you ever thought possible. Tension hung over the ranch in the days that followed. Cole kept his rifle closer. Ellie, sensing the shift, asked fewer questions, but watched more closely. Her eyes, once heavy with sorrow, now burned with alertness. She had known danger before, the kind that hides in plain sight and smiles while it steals. But this time, she wasn't running. This time, she had someone standing in front of her. Someone who wouldn't trade silence for safety. Cole reinforced the fences, patched the gate, taught Ellie how to load shotgun. Not because he wanted her to use it, but because he believed knowledge was armor. They trained in the early light, her hands trembling the first few tries, then steadying. "I don't want to hurt anyone," she said. "You don't have to," Cole replied. "Just remind them you can." It wasn't the kind of lesson schools taught, but it was the kind the West required. Meanwhile, Pike's threats grew quieter and closer. Fences were found cut. A calf went missing. The well was poisoned one morning, forcing Cole to ride for water while Ellie kept the fire going. Each incident was a whisper of the storm coming, not just against the ranch, but against the fragile peace they had built together. Cole wrote down everything, made visits to the sheriff, but justice in the West moved slower than vultures circling a dying steer. One evening, Ellie found another note on the porch. This one wasn't from her. It was from Pike. "You can't hold off the world forever. Sooner or later, something breaks." Cole crumpled it without reading it twice. Ellie saw the fear behind his eyes. Not fear of dying, but fear of losing her. That night, she placed her harmonica beside his bed and whispered, "Then let's not break." It wasn't defiance. It was a promise. And so, they waited. Not helpless. Not hopeless. But ready. Because in the Old West, survival wasn't just about land or bullets. It was about holding on to what mattered, to who you loved, to the tiny things that made life worth fighting for. Cole had once dug a grave for himself. Now, he was building a fortress, not with walls, but with purpose. And Ellie stood beside him, not as a guest, not as a burden, but as kin. The fifth night after the warning, the dogs barked like they'd sensed something wrong before it even crossed the hills. Cole was already awake. He'd been sleeping in shifts, boots on, rifle beside the bed. Ellie stirred too. No words, just instinct. She reached for the lantern while Cole stepped out onto the porch, the boards creaking under his weight. In the distance, just beyond the fence line, he saw shadows moving. Not coyotes, not deer. Men. They came with torches, slow and deliberate, like they'd rehearsed this. There were 4 of them, maybe 5. Hard to tell in the dark. Cole didn't wait. He raised his rifle and fired once, high and loud. Not to hit, just to speak the language the West understood best. The figures froze, then scattered like roaches. One dropped a torch that quickly caught the dry grass. Cole ran, stomping it out with his boots, smoke curling around his legs. Ellie stood in the doorway, holding the shotgun like it weighed 100 pounds, but she didn't flinch. By dawn, the ranch was safe. No damage, no injuries, just scorched earth and shaken breath. But the message was clear. Pike wouldn't stop. He wasn't looking to win a fight. He was looking to wear them down, to convince them that love and hope were luxuries too heavy for this land. Cole sat by the fire that morning, staring into the embers. "They think I'm still the man who gave up," he muttered. Ellie sat beside him. "Let them think it," she said. "We know better." That day, Cole rode into town. He didn't go to the sheriff. He went to the church, the store, the blacksmith, every place where men and women gathered and remembered what it meant to stand for something. "You all know what Pike is doing," he said, voice hard as oak. "He won't stop with me. He never does. But you get to decide if that's the kind of town you want your children growing up in." He didn't beg. He didn't plead. He just spoke the truth and let it hang like smoke above the rooftops. Some looked away, but others nodded. The West had always been wild, but it wasn't lawless. It had rules, deep ones, etched in blood and fire. Protect the innocent, honor your word, and never let a good man stand alone. By sunset, 5 neighbors rode to Cole's ranch. One brought water. Another brought nails and fresh wood for the fences. The last brought nothing but a saddle and a steady hand. They didn't come to fight. They came to stand. Pike didn't expect resistance. Not like this. When he rode past the ridge a day later and saw men working the fence beside Cole. His smirk faded. These weren't vigilantes. They were ranchers, teachers, farmers, quiet folk who didn't usually get involved. That's what scared him most. Not their rifles. Their unity. In a place where everyone had once looked out for themselves, now they were watching out for each other. And it had all started with a girl, and a grave that was never filled. Back at the ranch, Ellie was blooming. She still bore the scars of what she'd endured, but they no longer defined her. She helped with cattle, fixed meals, and wrote notes she'd never send, letters to her mother, to the parts of her past she wasn't ready to speak out loud. Cole gave her space to write, and in return, she gave him reason to keep going. Their bond wasn't made of blood or duty. It was made of choice, and in the West, that meant everything. One evening, while repairing the barn door, Ellie asked, "Why'd you dig that grave, really?" Cole paused. He could have lied, said he was fixing something or digging for drainage. But he didn't, because I didn't think I had anything left worth staying for. Ellie nodded slowly. And now, Cole looked at her, at the land, at the firelight flickering inside their home. Now I dig 10 more, just to keep what we have safe. It wasn't poetry. It was truth. The winds picked up that night, dry, wild, the kind that carried more than dust. But inside the house, there was warmth. Ellie played the harmonica with a little more confidence. Cole cooked beans over the fire like his wife used to. The world outside might have been unforgiving, but inside those walls, there was proof that the human spirit, bruised and bent, could still root itself in the hardest soil and grow. And even as danger lurked in the hills, something stronger had already taken hold. A family. Not born, but chosen. Not perfect, but unshakable. The kind of bond that makes men brave, that makes girls into warriors, and that turns even the loneliest places into something sacred. In the heart of the West, where grief had once whispered the end, hope now spoke something else entirely. We're still here, and we're not leaving. The days grew longer, and though Pike's men didn't return, the shadow of them never fully lifted. Cole remained vigilant, but something had shifted inside him, not just in posture, but in presence. He walked like a man with purpose again, his shoulders no longer stooped under grief. Ellie followed him step for step, learning the land, learning the signs, and learning him. She had come to the ranch as a ghost of herself. Now, she was becoming something more, a daughter not by birth, but by bond. That summer, a stranger came to town. He was young, dusty, with a nervous way about him. Said he was looking for a girl who might have been lost near the southern border. Said he heard she left a note on someone's door. When he spoke her name, Ellie, the whole saloon went quiet. Cole, who happened to be in town for supplies, stepped forward. "She's not lost," he said, calm but clear. "She's home." The stranger blinked. "I'm her cousin," he explained. "My family. We didn't know she'd made it." "We thought," he didn't finish. He didn't need to. Back at the ranch, Cole told Ellie everything. She was quiet for a long time. Then she asked, "Does he want to take me?" Cole paused. I didn't let him finish. I told him the door was open if you wanted to speak to him. But if not, this is your home. She nodded. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat under the stars with her harmonica, playing the same soft tune that had once brought Cole back from the edge. And in the morning, she made her choice. "I'll meet him," she said, "but I'm not leaving." The meeting was brief. The cousin cried, told her that her mother had tried to get back to her before the sickness took her, that they had searched, asked questions, but in the West, lost girls often disappeared without trace. "I'm sorry we weren't there," he said. Ellie just nodded. She wasn't angry. She wasn't bitter. She had simply found something now that couldn't be replaced, a life built on healing, not haunted memory. She hugged him goodbye, then watched him ride off into the same dust she'd once walked through alone. And with that, the last tie to her past was gently untangled. She was no longer the crying girl with a note in her hand. She was Ellie, fierce, rooted, and home for good. Cole watched her from the porch that evening, the same porch where they'd first sat side by side in silence. And for the first time since burying his wife, he whispered something aloud to the wind. "Thank you for sending her to my door." Time moved on, as it always does in the West. The hills changed color. The rains returned, and Ridgetop Valley found its rhythm again. Cole and Ellie worked the ranch as equals. He with the strength of experience, she with the energy of hope. Together, they brought the land back to life, field by field, season by season. What once felt like a graveyard of memories had become something living, pulsing with cattle, crops, and laughter that echoed across the canyons. The town, too, had changed. Inspired by what had happened at Cole's ranch, more folks began looking out for each other. A new schoolhouse was built. The sheriff appointed deputies not based on name or family, but on character. People started saying, "Good morning," again like they meant it. And Ellie, though still young, became a symbol, not of pity, but of perseverance. Whenever someone spoke of her story, it was never in hushed tones. It was with pride. One autumn, during a harvest festival, Cole found himself standing beside the same preacher who had once presided over his wife's funeral. The man looked at him and said, "You know, for someone who dug his own grave, you sure planted one hell of a garden." Cole chuckled, the sound rusty but real. "Sometimes," he said, "you dig one thing, and life hands you another." He looked across the crowd, saw Ellie laughing with other kids, saw the land bathed in golden light. And for the first time in decades, he felt whole. But the West never forgets. One afternoon, Cole discovered a broken horseshoe nailed to his barn, an old sign among ranchers that someone's watching. A message. Pike was still out there. Maybe not active, but not gone. Cole didn't panic. He reinforced the fences again. He cleaned a rifle. He told Ellie the truth. And she, without flinching, said, "Let him come. He won't break this." Not defiance, just certainty. And so they continued, not in fear, but in readiness. Because what they had built wasn't fragile. It was forged in pain, watered with silence, and grown in the hard soil of the frontier. They didn't owe anyone an explanation. They owed only to each other, to wake up each day, tend the land, feed the animals, and make sure no one ever felt as lost as they once had. That was their mission. And in the West, that was more powerful than any name, gun, or grudge. The first snow came early that year, soft, silent, and clean, covering the ranch in a blanket of white that made even the old scars of the land seem gentle. Ellie stood outside watching it fall, her breath puffing out in clouds, her fingers red from the cold. Cole stood behind her on the porch, arms crossed, a rare smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You ever seen snow like this?" he asked. Ellie shook her head. "Only in stories." And then, almost shyly, she added, "It's quieter than I thought." That winter brought a different rhythm. The days slowed, but the work never stopped. Together they chopped wood, hauled water, and kept the hearth alive. Ellie had become more than company. She had become capable. Cole trusted her with the animals, with the keys to the tool shed, even with the books his wife once kept by the window. At night, they read together, Ellie tracing words with her finger, Cole listening like the pages were being spoken directly to his soul. One evening, after a long day of mending a collapsed chicken coop, Ellie found an old photograph in a drawer. Cole and his wife, years younger, standing by the same porch. She brought it to him without a word. He stared at it a long time, thumb brushing over the faded edges. "She would have liked you," he said finally. "You have the same fire." Ellie smiled, but her voice dropped. "Do you miss her?" Cole's answer came slow. "Every day, but I don't ache the same. Not since you knocked on my door." That night, they hung the photograph in the hallway, not as a memorial, but as a thread connecting past to present. A reminder that love, even once lost, could plant seeds in unexpected places. And though the snow outside thickened and the wind howled against the windows, inside their home, there was warmth. Not just from fire, but from purpose, from knowing they had built something sacred, right where death once tried to dig its roots. And while Pike's presence still hovered like a storm too distant to track, Cole didn't speak of it much. Not because he'd forgotten, but because he'd outgrown the fear. Ellie no longer looked over her shoulder. She looked forward, toward spring, toward the life they were still building, toward a future that wasn't promised, but was finally possible. By spring, the land was alive again. Green hills rolling like waves, cattle grazing under wide skies, and wildflowers pushing through the soil as if the ground itself had remembered how to breathe. Cole and Ellie rose with the sun each morning, their boots hitting the porch in unison, their hands busy with work, their hearts quiet but full. They didn't talk about survival anymore. They talked about next season, about fencing off a new pasture, about adding a second room to the house, about tomorrow. People still came by, not just for help, but for wisdom. The ranch had become something more than a home. It had become a symbol, not of wealth or pride, but of resilience, of what could grow when someone chooses to stay. Cole never gave speeches. He didn't preach. He just lived, steady and honest. And in a world still full of wandering souls, that alone was enough to inspire. One morning, Ellie brought home a stray dog. Mangy, limping, scared of every sound. "She reminds me of me," she said. Cole looked at the trembling mutt, then at Ellie. "Then we'll do the same for her, as we did for you. Let her stay." It was a small gesture, but in that moment, Ellie understood something deeper. That home isn't something you're given. It's something you help build, one act of compassion at a time. As the sun set that evening, painting the hills in gold, Cole and Ellie stood side by side at the edge of the pasture. She had grown taller. He had grown older. But the bond between them, silent, unspoken, unbreakable, had only deepened. What began with a grave dug in grief had become a life neither of them expected, but both of them deserved. And though the West would always be wild, though loss would always linger in the edges of the wind, what mattered now wasn't what had been taken, but what had been rebuilt. A ranch, a home, a family, and the kind of love that doesn't have to be spoken aloud to be felt forever. In a land where silence once weighed heavier than grief, one knock at a door rewrote everything. What began with a shovel and a grave ended with two broken souls learning how to rebuild, not just a ranch, but each other. Cole had nothing left but memory. Ellie had nothing left but hope. Yet in the dry heart of the West, where most things fade under sun and wind, they found something rare. They found belonging. And it wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, steady, and sacred. This story isn't just about survival. It's about the kind of courage that doesn't come from drawing a gun, but from staying when it's easier to walk away. It's about seeing something broken and choosing to hold it, not to fix it right away, but to keep it from slipping further into the dark. And sometimes, that's all it takes. A porch light left on, a note written by a trembling hand, a man who chooses not to climb into the hole he dug. Sometimes, healing begins with simply showing up. There's a truth here that doesn't belong only to the West. It belongs to all of us. Because sooner or later, life hands each person a moment where giving up feels easier than going on. And in that moment, what saves us isn't always a miracle. It might just be someone who understands. Someone who says, "You're not alone." Or someone brave enough to knock on a door when everything feels too quiet. These are the small revolutions that change the course of a life. So maybe what we carry forward isn't just a story of a rancher and a girl, but a reminder that family is not made only by blood. That healing doesn't come all at once, but in the slow return of trust. And that sometimes, when we're ready to give up, the universe answers with a note that simply says, "Please don't go." And maybe that's enough. If this story moved something in you, if it reminded you of someone, or helped you feel a little less alone, leave a comment and share your thoughts. We'd love to hear your voice. And if you want to keep walking through stories that carry meaning, hope, and soul, subscribe, like the video, and stay close. Because around here, we believe every heart, no matter how wounded, deserves a second sunrise.